Cold.
Thank you, Penny, for meeting with me again. And I'm sorry I forgot to save the first time we recorded this. So we're having a second conference on the same IPDP.
No problem. It's summer.
It is summer. So thinking back to your lesson at the end of May, we talked about some areas of strength. Do you remember what you felt your strengths were?
I know that I do a fairly decent job of setting up routines and expectations.
Absolutely.
And that helps us to be a lot more focused when kids are in group. You know, we also have an expectation for them to be respectful and kind to each other, which I think also helps. I also believe that I do a really good job of sticking to the objective and keeping the lesson tight to the objective. So,
Another strength you identified were your nonverbal scaffolds.
yes. Yes, and you helped, and you reinforced that idea by noticing the anchor charts and stuff that we had on the wall.
You also talked about 2 growth areas. Do you remember those growth areas?
I remember one being my concern with kids who weren't sure what to do when I wasn't able to attend to them right away, when they were ready to conference with me or to have me look at their work. And so I know that one thing that's heavy on my mind next year is that idea of what are the things that you do while you're, waiting to conference with the teacher.
And the other one, do you remember?
That was specifically with, that was my behavior, which had to do with conferencing. I had gotten away from the conference mode and had been doing more of that popcorn coaching, which, I've talked to you about before, is something that the teachers I'm working with have a really hard time overcoming. And so here I was starting to fall into that habit. So I was concerned about that just from it.
What insights did you gain about your teaching, how your teaching affects your students?
Well, I think the thing that most, over the course of the year, I've realized is that when you're very deliberate about teaching something and you keep going back to that until it's learned, that kids do learn it and they can use it. So in this particular instance, we're learning the writing process. So every time we look at their writing, we talk about where they were at in the writing process. And now they're able to think about that more as a process instead of just something that they sit down and they write and write and write and write and think they're done. And the thing that I know I realized was that you have to teach them how to plan. Kids don't know how to plan, and you have to show them what that looks like and the different ways that it can look, but that it's not the same thing as drafting. So that's something that toward the end, when I realized that that element was weak in my own teaching, what I had taught them, I really started to spend a lot of time on that.
So your role really is a sim coach, and that's learning an intervention very well, teaching it to Title I and special educators, and then coaching them throughout the year to help them strengthen. So what is the purpose of working with the students you were working with? You had 3 students, Daniel, Lauren, and Ava. What was your purpose for working with them this year?
Well, I see that part of my role as really vital to giving me credibility, but also keeping me grounded and keeping me learning and strengthening my skills in the area of literacy and being responsive to kids, learning how to be a kid watcher and be responsive to, what they're doing well and how I can use that to close some of the deficits that they have.
So how will that help you as a teacher leader with your SIM interventionists?
Well, like I said, I think it helps give me credibility, but then I also think it gives me examples that I can choose from. So this year I started doing writing aloud with my students because I knew that next year that was where we were going to focus our learning around was writing aloud. And so by my doing it, then I can kind of bring in those stories. Not just the stories about this is what's worked for me, but let me tell you, this didn't work for me, or while I was doing this, I lost sight of. So I make myself a little bit vulnerable there, but at the same time, I think it does give me credibility and it helps me relate more to the teachers, because oftentimes I can understand a lot more of their challenges because I've experienced the same thing.
So you've already thought about your IPDP for next year, and we've talked a little bit about that, but your plan is to continue learning about writing aloud so that you can better support your interventionists. How will what you've learned about your strengths and areas to improve on help your teachers in the fall?
Well, one thing I've learned about the teachers in this district is when they come into a PD situation, they expect me to have the answers. I don't always have the answers. And this was really difficult the first year when we were trying to learn together and discover together. That was really difficult for the teachers and for me. This past year it was a little bit better because with the second cohort that was learning Guided Reading Plus, because I had some of those answers. And sometimes I had the answer, but I would ask a question to get them to think about the answer. I would then know enough to ask the right question, but then if they started going down a path that was not the right path, I could get them back because I knew it wasn't the right path. Now, with the teachers that were going through new learning this year, it also made it a little bit easier because I had more experience in learning how to find out the answers, through the texts, through the textbooks and the other resources that we had. So I anticipate that some this year, that I've got enough knowledge to begin that learning process with them, even though I don't know it all, and I only know how it looked for my kids at this particular grade level, at this particular reading level, and focusing on learning how to summarize, for instance, or how to do a summary in writing. And that it could look very different across settings, because maybe it's a different grade level, maybe it's a different level of reading, maybe there's a different focus for the writing. So maybe, instead of summarizing, they're going to be learning how to compare and contrast, or something different depending on what the focus in the classroom is. But I think I know how to navigate that a little bit better, and I'll be a better facilitator of the learning for those teachers. Did that address your question, or did I get totally off base?
I think it addressed my question.
Okay.
So some of your strength areas were helping the students understand the process of writing, your nonverbal scaffolds, how will you carry that information to your adult learners?
That's an easy one. I think they have to see, and some of them who weren't used to using anchor charts, especially as a continual resource, that they, I want them to have that example of, even if it's not an anchor chart that details the writing process, but just to have that idea that that anchor chart is vital as a nonverbal scaffold and as a resource that kids can go to. And that ties back to that goal area that I have for what do kids do when the teacher can't meet with them? Well, they can go back to their resource and do that double check and really think more deeply about their own piece of writing. But I just think the example of this is your anchor chart, use it and use it over and over and over again, because that's going to strengthen the learning of the students. It's going to promote their independence.
So how will you know that you're successful
With my adult learners?
with your adult learners?
I think what I see when I go in to do to observe a lesson and do a coaching session is going to help me know whether or not they're beginning to incorporate the kinds of things that I'm trying to facilitate. It's either going to be there or it's not going to be there. And if it's not there, then it's an easy thing to coach for. Remember we talked about, or even in that pre-conference situation, to be able to say, how are you going to use your anchor charts in this lesson today? Or what anchor charts do you have to use in this lesson today? What resources do you have to use? And then that gives me that foot in the door when we post-conference to say, how did you use your anchor charts today?
So when you're thinking about collecting data, you'll have your anecdotal notes that you just talked about. What else? Do you have a checklist, or what else do you use?
I do have I don't want to call it a checklist, it's an observation form that it's more like it details the structure of the lesson with the various options that I might see. And so as I look for those options, I do make a note, I do check them. If I see that, try to describe it a little bit. And then that gives us a basis for looking at what was present in the lesson and what maybe could have been present that wasn't there. Or why didn't we choose to use this? Because sometimes there's a conscious decision not to use something because there's no evidence that it needs to be used.
So as you're thinking about next year, what happens when you're delivering this intervention to the adults if you see that it's not being carried over in their teaching as you're coaching them? What kinds of actions would you take?
Well,
I could see that's caused a little stress in the past.
If it's really important, then right or wrong, I start bringing it up.
Making them a little uncomfortable.
When we've been in PD, we've talked about XYZ. And again, it's best if this can come up in the pre-conference. How are you going to provide XYZ today? And, so that they are forced to think about that and try to incorporate that into their lesson. And then my coming in on the tail end saying, tell me how you think, how did XYZ work for you today? So then they have to identify, well, you know what, it wasn't in my lesson, or it was in my lesson and this is how it worked. But either way, their attention's been drawn to it as something that's important to me.
So it sounds to me like you have multiple data sources, your anecdotal notes, your checklists, your planning conferences.
Well, I would even say some of the tools from the main text that we use from interventions that work also are a resource for us. I don't go into a coaching session without that resource, because then if I ask a question and they're not sure what I mean, I can flip open the book and say, well, let's look at some examples of XYZ. Let's look at what the text says about this. So then it gets them right back into the research and the literature.
So, oh, thank you. You are the area expert on writing aloud, and that's what you want to base your IPDP on. So what?
I don't know that I'm an expert, but
You're
I'm working on it.
the resident expert.
Okay.
So what are you needing for supports?
Wow, that's a
You
good
talk-
question. I have not thought about that.
You've talked about your interventions that work. In our first conference that we had,
okay.
we talked
Yes,
about
we
that
did.
not being the biggest piece of information for you, that you had to go beyond.
Well, last year when I knew, or this past year, when I knew that we would be focusing on the interactive writing piece, I did look at what other resources were available out there from Dorn and Sophos, and I was able to order a video set on the assisted writing interventions. So not only interactive writing, but that also included writing aloud. So I have that piece that I can use. I also have just various resources that address writing and apprenticeship in writing and scaffolding, writers. So those are all pieces that can act as resources, and sometimes even before I discover what's in those, I structure up learning in PD that says we're going to use these resources, and what we're specifically looking for today is what the resources have to say about this particular question, and then get students researching that.
So it sounds to me like the PD you deliver, you're learning right along with those teachers, and you're using
Oftentimes.
them as a resource to help you deepen your understanding.
Oh yeah. I mean, not only that in class PD, but when I'm out coaching, I'm often being coached. Whether or not they've ever thought of it that way, I don't know. But when I watch their lessons, I'm learning. I'm learning from them just as much as they're learning from me. So
What
it's a very
others-
reciprocal thing.
Sorry. What other supports do you have? Do you have other people that you can turn to, other SIM interventionists, or SIM teacher leaders?
Not in this district necessarily, but in other districts. For instance, our PCL cohort that we went through, you and I with, those folks, they're all on my email list, and so oftentimes if I have a question, I can email the group at large, or I can email one or two of those folks that I think may, for instance, I know that Ann Schreck in Waterloo has done writing aloud and has done it for a couple of years now. So, I would look at her as a good resource. I know that I can contact Sally Forbes and say, talk to me more about, and in fact I did that this year with the interactive writing piece, when there was an issue with that. So I've got those as people resources in my network too.
So it sounds like you really do have a lot of resources, and you have a wide range of people you can network with and learn from and collaborate with.
I think so. Yeah.
So as we're thinking about your IPDP, what is your timeline for learning what you need to learn to carry out your plan?
Well, that's an interesting question, because what I'll do is I will more than likely try to plan out the first 2 sessions around content learning, just about the structure of the intervention, the resources that are needed, the kinds of kids this is appropriate for, and that kind of thing. Beyond that, what I try to do is be sensitive to the questions that they have or be sensitive to what I start to see when I'm out observing, because then that oftentimes directs where I go with the professional development after that. So they have questions about how to implement that phase 2 over a few days. I anticipate that that is something that could surface right away, and what that looks like, and how do we move kids through the writing process, and is there enough time to do that in a few days, and that kind of thing. Then we spend time addressing that and possibly generating ideas, or going back to the literature to say, well, let's see what we find out from literature. Is this addressed in the literature? What does the literature say about it? Or, if the literature doesn't address it directly, do we get any clues about how to do it otherwise?
So it sounds like it's a year-long process. It's going to take you all year to deliver this PD. What happens if you have a teacher who has not been successful the first year?
Have I told you about this?
Yes, I've heard about this.
Okay. Well, I had a situation like that this year. Really just one, but there are 2 teachers that I have asked to not enter into learning around the new content next year, because I want them to be more solid on what they learned this year. And one of the teachers just had lots of areas of confusion still after they were addressed. And I asked that she, continue to engage with me in the coaching process around the learning that she had this past year. And we'll get her solid on that, and then she'll rejoin the group the following year. The other teacher actually did a pretty good job at a basic level, but she's having a baby at the first part of September, so rather than have her miss that new content and be in catch-up mode when she gets back from maternity leave, I just recommended that she again continue to engage with me in coaching, and then rejoin the group the next year when we learn another intervention.
Sometimes those are touchy subjects
Yeah.
when you're working with adults. They really think they're doing the best that they can do, and
Oh,
that's
they
their
are.
intention.
They are doing the best that they can do, and and I tell them that, but I also tell them that it's not ethical of me to ask them, that I'm setting them up for failure if I ask them to engage in new learning before they're solid on this old learning. The same thing we do with our students.
That's exactly right.
I wouldn't do that to a student, so they are my students.
That's right, they are. So how has this conference helped you today?
You have some, at least 2 really good questions that got me thinking a little bit deeper. One was around the timeline, I think, just this most recent one about engaging in this work and planning for the work, which I just take an approach to being responsive
Right.
to their needs. And then there was an earlier one too that I know I just really had to stop and think about, but I appreciate the chance to reflect again on the process,
The
because
second time.
because what's happening as a result is it's cementing in my head even more some of the things I need to be in tune to next year when I start my new group, because I got 2-3 months before I start up with a new group.
So you have a lot of work to do this
Um,
summer just to prepare yourself.
There's a lot that I can forget in 2 to 3 months, so I'm less likely to forget this now.
You can have a copy of the video if I remember to save it this time.
That's okay. I can do without having to